In the year 1885, the first edition of the biography of mountain man Isaac P. Rose was printed, enthralling the nation in tales of adventure, hardship, violence, and survival. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral as we share one of our favorite excerpts from this seminal text. Sit back, relax, and enjoy as we explore the wild life of the American mountain man as related in 4 Years in the Rockies. Chapter 28. The Rendezvous, Arrival of Grand Visitors, Trip to Wind River, and a Fight with the Blackfeet. The season now being far advanced and time for the rendezvous nearly at hand, Jim Bridger and his company left Jackson's Hole and commenced moving toward Green River, trapping as they went. It was during this trip that Rose met with a rather curious adventure and had what might be called a very narrow escape. The ground over which they had been traveling for some days was so stony or gravelly, it was hard on the horses' feet. In fact, some of them became so sore that they could hardly travel, and the trappers were compelled to make moccasins for them out of rawhide. Rose, wishing to make up for lost time, determined to try his luck on a small stream, in which beaver were said to be plenty. But the spot was known to be infested by Blackfeet, and few of the trappers felt inclined to venture out in that direction. As the horse belonging to Rose was too lame to travel, he started an old mule belonging to the company, and Rose says it was one of the most stubborn brutes he ever saw. No amount of coaxing, whipping, or spurring would induce it to get out of a walk. In fact, when he felt the spur touch his flanks, he would stop at once and commence biting at the rider's feet. But as the mule's hooves were sound, Rose concluded that anything would be better than walking. He felt convinced, however, that if chased by the Blackfeet, he should be compelled to leave the mule and trust his own legs for safety. About 5 miles from camp, he shot a deer, and, taking from it the fat ribs, he cooked enough to do him for a day or two, taking the balance along in case he should need it. A little after nightfall, he reached his destination, and as beaver signs were good, he at once set up his traps. He hung his venison on a bush, tethered his mule, and rolled himself into blankets, then laid down in the bushes and went to sleep. How long he slept, he didn't know. He was suddenly awakened by the snorting of the mule, and, springing to his feet, rifle in hand, he saw a large grizzly bear walking off with his venison. Cocking his rifle, he was about to fire, when Caleb, the trapper's colloquial name for the grizzly bear, disappeared into the bushes. It being too dark to follow the monster, Rose again laid down, and slept until near daylight. Then, taking up his traps, he discovered he had caught 4 good beaver. While engaged in skinning them, he fancied he smelt smoke and a fire, and, hurrying up the skinning process, he packed his traps and, mounting his mule, rode out of the bushes to a small hill close by. From the top of this, he was horrified to perceive a camp of nearly 200 Blackfeet Indians, not more than 200 yards above him on the stream. It being still dark, Rose had not been seen, and he immediately started for camp, expecting to hear the howls of warriors on his trail. On reaching a hill near his own camp, he saw 2 Indians lying flat on the ground, reconnoitering. Rose felt certain he could kill one of them, but then what was to prevent the other from killing him? Just as he was considering what was best to be done, the Indians caught sight of him, and, springing to their feet, ran off at full speed, and Rose rode into camp with his old mule and beaver skins, thinking that he had made a very narrow escape. The rendezvous of 1837 was a very grand affair, and the new supply of stores was very much needed. The company had done a great deal of trading during the year, and their stock of goods had been nearly exhausted for some time. In fact, the trappers had not been in as bad a fix since their trip to the Humboldt River. Their blankets were worn out, and their ammunition was getting low. And Jim Bridger, legendary mountain man, began to get scared, as an encounter with the Blackfeet, under these circumstances, would have been dangerous. but the caravan from St. Louis made its appearance at about the usual time, and laughter, fun, and frolic were, once more, the order of the day. Several visitors came out with the train from St. Louis this year. Mr. Gray, the missionary, returned to the mountains, bringing with him his wife and 4 other ladies, all bound for the mission on the Columbia River. An English nobleman, known as Sir William Stewart, called by the trappers Captain Stewart, also came out with the train, bringing with him a retinue of servants and a number of splendid horses. This was Captain Stewart's second trip to the mountains, he having been delighted with his first visit. He brought with him lots of stores and regaled the whole of the trappers with a grand entertainment. He also made them some very valuable presents, giving Bridger, Kit Carson, and Joe Meek, with whom he had become acquainted on his first visit, each a valuable horse, and to many of the other trappers he also gave costly presents. It was at this entertainment that Rose partook of some water and crackers, this being the first thing of the kind he had eaten since his stay in the mountains, and the boys all thought it a great delicacy. The Delaware and Shawnee Indians came in large numbers to trade, and that summer Jim Bridger sent over 100 packs of beaver skins to St. Louis, together with a large quantity of buffalo robes and grizzly pelts. There was the usual amount of drinking, carousing, and horse racing, and altogether the rendezvous of this year presented a remarkably lively appearance. When the rendezvous was pretty well over, and the time for fall trapping was drawing near, Bridger called in Rose and Carson for the purpose of holding a powwow as to the route it would be best to take for the fall hunt. Rose was in favor of the Wind River, as beaver were known to be plentiful in all of the streams that took their rise in the Wind River Mountains. But to reach this desirable location, it would be necessary to pass through the heart of Blackfeet country, and, in all probability, they would have to do some tall fighting. But, as the idea of a fight with the Blackfoot was not likely to prove an objection to their taking that route, that, in fact, to many of the trappers it would be an inducement, it was agreed by Bridger and his partners that the Wind River should be the scene of operations for the first part of the fall hunt. All things now in readiness, Bridger and his company started for the Wind River Mountains, and nothing of interest occurred for the first 2 or 3 days. On the 4th day, however, Rose, Meek, and about 30 or 40 of the other trappers set out to travel up the river to the headwaters, accompanied by the famous Indian painter Stanley, whose party was met with, this fall, traveling among the mountains. The party of trappers were a day or 2 ahead of the main camp when they found themselves following close after a big Blackfeet village, which had recently passed over the trail, as could be seen by the usual signs, also by the dead bodies strewn along the trail, victims to that horrible scourge, smallpox. The village was evidently fleeing to the mountains, hoping to rid itself of the plague in their colder and more salubrious air. Not long after coming to these evidences of proximity to an enemy, a party of 150 of their warriors were discovered encamped in a defile or narrow bottom enclosed by high bluffs through which the trappers would have to pass. Seeing that in order to pass the war party and the village, which was about half a mile in advance, there would be some fighting to be done, the trappers resolved to begin the battle at once by attacking their enemies, who were as yet ignorant of their presence in the neighborhood. In pursuance of this determination, Rose, Meek, and a number of other trappers commenced hostilities. Leaving their horses in camp, they crawled along the edge of the overhanging bluff until opposite of the encampment of Blackfeet, then fired on them from the shelter of some bushes which grew along the rocks. But the Blackfeet, though ignorant of the number of enemies, were not to be dislodged so easily, and, after an hour or 2 of random shooting, contrived to scale the bluffs at a point higher up and to get upon a ridge of ground still higher than that occupied by the trappers. This movement dislodged the latter, and they hastily retreated through the bushes and returned to camp. The next day, the main camp having come up, the fight was renewed. While the greater body of the company with the pack horses were passing along the high bluffs overhanging them, the party of the day before and 40 or 50 others undertook to drive the Indians from the bottom and, by keeping them engaged, allow the train to pass in safely. This they contrived to do, and, after some heavy skirmishing, the Indians were compelled to retreat to their village, and Bridger and his company continued to the Wind River without meeting any further adventure. Chapter 29. The Fall Hunt. Ammunition runs short. Rose volunteers to go to Fort Laramie. Rose's adventures with the Gros Ventre, and his safe return. The fall hunt did not prove as successful as anticipated. Though beaver were plentiful on the Wind River, the company were continually annoyed by prowling bands of Blackfeet, who were hovering around the camp in hopes of cutting off some straggling trapper or stampeding and stealing some of the horses. This annoyance interfered considerably with the trappers' business, as they were compelled to hunt in strong squads. Even then, they would often lose some of their traps. This was not at all a healthy situation for the trappers to be placed in, but it was still more unhealthy for the Blackfeet, several of whom were caught sneaking around the camp and sent to the happy hunting grounds by the deadly rifle fire of the trappers. To add to their misfortune and annoyance, it was found that their ammunition was running short, and it would be impossible for them to continue on unless a fresh supply could be obtained from some quarter. In fact, Bridger began to get very uneasy, and towards the latter end of October, he sent Tom Briggs with 10 men and some pack horses to Fort Laramie to procure the needed supplies, and with strict orders to return with them at once before winter set in. But, unfortunately, cold and stormy weather came on early that winter, and before the middle of November, the company proceeded to their winter headquarters on the Yellowstone. By the latter end of November, the winter appeared to be set in earnest. There were continual and heavy storms, and all the streams in that region were frozen over. A small party of the trappers got lost, and had been given up for some time, as it would be impossible for horses to travel through the snow, and Bridger began to be very much alarmed at the safety of the company. Several consultations were held as to what was best to be done under the circumstances. Bridger thought the lost trappers had been gobbled up by the Indians, or they would most assuredly have been back before winter set in. At length, Rose volunteered to go to Fort Laramie if one of the other trappers would accompany him. But this, at first, none of them seemed inclined to do. But after 2 days' consideration, a trapper by the name of David Woods volunteered to go, and it was agreed that Rose and Woods should start the next morning. The accoutrements of their journey consisted, besides their rifles and ammunition, of a buffalo robe and a blanket for each, and a pair of snowshoes. Thus equipped, and provided with 2 days' ration of buffalo meat, they started on a perilous journey of 300 miles, through a wild and mountainous country covered with snow, which in some places was 50 or 60 feet deep, and knowing that at any time they were likely to fall in with a savage grizzly or the still more dangerous Blackfeet. With a farewell cheer from their comrades, and with, quote, "health that mocks the doctor's rules, and knowledge never learned in schools," they commenced their first day's journey to Fort Laramie. The first night, they thought they had accomplished about 25 miles of their journey, and they camped near a small stream. They scooped a hole in the snow, and breaking off some pine bushes for a bed, they rolled themselves in their blankets and buffalo robes and slept soundly till morning. They found, however, that the travel of the day before had strained their insteps to such a degree that they could scarcely walk, and it was only after a great deal of rubbing that they were able to travel with their snowshoes. The second day, they did not make more than 10 miles before their feet gave out completely. They had reached the banks of a small river, comparatively free of snow, and had seated themselves on a log to rest, when a couple of deer came trotting down on the other side of the stream. Rose immediately took his rifle from its pouch and shot one of them. Then, gathering a lot of dry limbs, they built a fire and feasted sumptuously on the venison steak. Then, replenishing their fire, they laid down between it and the log they had set on, and slept comfortably until morning. In the morning, finding their insteps were too sore to travel, they rested another day. The next morning, being thoroughly rested, Rose proposed that they should put up some soft buffalo skin between the strap of the snowshoe and their insteps. This they found acted like a charm, and from that time forward they had no more trouble with their snowshoes. After about 2 weeks they struck the Sweetwater, and a few days after reached the North Platte, and, to their great joy, landed at Fort Laramie 2 days before Christmas. Here they found the lost party of trappers who had arrived at the fort in safety, but, owing to the winter having set in so early, they were afraid to attempt to rejoin their company. Rose and his comrade Woods were hospitably received and entertained, and they were glad to get a few days of rest after their long and perilous journey. Christmas was celebrated at the fort in the usual manner. A cannon that was mounted in the bastion was heavily loaded to be shot off as a grand Christmas gun. In order to make a louder report, an old pair of buckskin pants and several pairs of old moccasins were rammed in till the gun was filled nearly to the muzzle. The gunner refused to touch the cannon off, as he said there was sure to be a burst. Dave Crow, one of the crappers and a particular friend of Rose's, took the iron rod from the fire and touched it off, and, as the gunner predicted, it flew into 100 pieces. One of the splinters broke Crow's leg. One of the men at the fort pretended to know all about dressing the wound, and Rose left his friend in his care. Rose was compelled to go up the Chugwater River with his horses, as the pasture was getting very poor around the fort. During his absence, his friend Crow died, the man caring for him having bandaged his leg so tightly that mortification set in. The trappers had a jolly time at the fort during winter. Rose says it was the most pleasant winter he spent during his stay in the mountains. While Rose was at the fort, Masalino, a Mexican trapper and scout who had been up at the Chugwater River, came in, bringing with him a vial that contained about an ounce of gold dust. The trappers, at first, laughed at the idea of its being gold, but the Mexican assured them that this was the pure stuff and added that his father and himself had worked in a gold mine for years. When the spring set in, Rose and several other trappers started to join Jim Bridger's company, having with them about 15 pack horses and mules loaded with goods and supplies. They journeyed about a week without meeting any adventure worth relating, when one day, about noon, having ascended up a steep ridge, they came upon a band of about 50 Groant Indians. These Indians are not as fierce as the Blackfeet, but are very imprudent and overbearing when they think they have the upper hand. The Groants halted about 150 yards from the trappers, and the chief came forward to hold a powwow. And one of the trappers leading the party went out to meet him. The chief assumed a very dictatorial tone. He said his band was poor and needed supplies, and that if the white man would give up their horses and mules with their packs, he would allow the trappers to go on their way unharmed. If not, they must take the consequences. The trapper said he would return to his company and consult with his men. This he did, looking pretty badly scared. He told the trappers that he thought it was the best thing they could do, and that perhaps giving up their horses and goods would be the only chance to save their lives. This speech made Rose very angry. He represented to the other trappers that he and his comrade Wood had traveled 300 miles in the depth of winter to secure the much-needed supplies for their company, and that the very existence of the American Fur Company who employed them depended on these supplies reaching them. He pointed out that the Groants were not much more than 3 to 1, that they were very poorly armed, not having more than a dozen rifles among them, the balance of their arms being bows and arrows and spears, that he would make peaceable terms with them if possible, but that he would fight as long as he had a bullet in his pouch before they should take a single horse or pack. Most of the trappers coincided with the views expressed by Rose, and the chief again came out, accompanied by a half-breed as his interpreter, and Rose and Masalino were appointed to meet with them and state their case. Rose told the chief that the white men had always been friendly to the Groants, and that they were willing and remained so, and that they were willing to make him some handsome presents. He stated that they were well armed, and before they would give up a single horse or pack, they would fight to the death. And, not to be beaten in bombast, Rose informed the chief that they had often whooped bands of Blackfeet when the odds were much greater against them. This speech acted like magic, and the chief and his interpreter returned to his band quite crestfallen. Rose and his party then took the packs from the mules, and the barrels of 15 rifles were pointed at the Indians, who, seeing the white men determined, accepted a few butcher knives and a couple of red blankets, and the trappers went on their way. In a few days, they arrived at the Rosebud, where they met with Jim Bridger and his company. The delight on receiving the longed-looked-for supplies can be better imagined than described. Thank you for joining us on the History at the OK Corral Book Club. If you like this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to watch more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the HOKC newsletter. Link is in the description. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.